The coldest revenge in history, how one man destroyed an entire dynasty to avenge his family. There is a particular kind of grief that does not make you weak. It makes you patient. And patience, when it is powered by the right kind of pain, is the most dangerous force in human history. This is the story of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark, King of Norway, and for 5 weeks at the end of his life, King of England. A man who spent decades dismantling a dynasty piece by piece, not out of greed, not out of ambition, but out of something far older and far colder than either of those things. This is a revenge story, and it is one of the most complete ones ever recorded. To understand what Sweyn did, you have to understand what was done to him first. The year is 986 AD. Sweyn is a young man, somewhere in his early 20s, and his father is Harald Bluetooth, the King of Denmark. Harald was a significant figure in his own right. He had unified Denmark, converted the Danes to Christianity, and left behind one of the most famous runestones in Scandinavian history. He was powerful, respected, and deeply convinced that he would remain both of those things indefinitely. He was wrong about the second part. Sweyn led a rebellion against his own father. History does not record every detail of why. The sources are incomplete, and the accounts vary. But what is consistent across them is this. Sweyn raised an army, challenged Harald directly, and in the fighting that followed, Harald was wounded. He fled Denmark by ship and died shortly after from his injuries, in exile, on foreign soil. His own son had driven him out. This is where the story gets complicated, because the man watching all of this from across the North Sea, watching a son overthrow a father, watching Denmark shift and destabilize, was a king who saw opportunity in chaos. His name was Ethelred, and history would later add a word to his name that tells you almost everything you need to know about him. Ethelred the Unready. Ethelred was King of England, and the title history gave him was not a compliment. Unready comes from the Old English, unread, meaning poorly counseled, or more precisely, a man who made bad decisions and kept making them even when the consequences were standing directly in front of him. He was exactly that kind of king. In the winter of 1002, Ethelred made a decision so catastrophically wrong that it would echo forward through decades and eventually bring the entire weight of a Viking king's grief down onto his kingdom. He ordered the massacre of every Dane living in England. It was called the St. Brice's Day Massacre. On the 13th of November, 1002, English populations across the country turned on their Danish neighbors, merchants, settlers, people who had lived in England for years, people who had built lives and raised children there. They were killed in their homes, in the streets, in churches where some had fled seeking sanctuary. The fires from one Oxford church, where Danes had barricaded themselves inside, burned so hot that the stone walls cracked. Ethelred had ordered the killing because he feared Danish influence in his kingdom, because he was receiving reports, accurate or not, of Danish plots against his throne, because he was, at his core, a man who responded to fear with violence and called it policy. What he did not fully calculate was who some of those people were. Among the dead at Oxford, among the Danes killed that November, was a woman named Gunhilda. Gunhilda was the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard. Let that settle for a moment. The King of England had just murdered the King of Denmark's sister, not on a battlefield. Not in a war that had already begun, but in a massacre of civilians, on a date chosen for a Christian feast day, carried out with the specific intention of eliminating Danish people from English soil. We do not have a detailed record of how Sweyn received the news. The sagas are not generous with those kinds of intimate moments. They record actions, not grief. But what Sweyn did next was recorded very clearly. He began preparing. The thing that separates Sweyn Forkbeard from other revenge stories in history is not the scale of what he eventually did. It is the patience. He did not sail for England immediately. He did not react with the hot, disorganized fury that Ethelred had probably expected, or perhaps hoped for, since a poorly planned Viking raid was something England had survived before. Instead, Sweyn spent the next decade becoming undeniable. He consolidated his hold on Denmark. He extended his power into Norway, eventually driving out King Olaf Tryggvason and absorbing Norway under his control. He raided English coastlines methodically, not to burn and retreat, but to weaken, to drain, to strip England of its resources and its confidence season by season, year by year. He was not raiding England. He was preparing it. Every time Ethelred paid the Dane Geld, the tribute money paid to Vikings to stop the attacks, Sweyn used it to fund the next campaign. England was literally financing its own destruction, handing silver to the man who intended to take everything. Ethelred kept paying. He had no better answer. Sweyn kept coming. He always had a better plan. The raids escalated through the early 1000s with a deliberateness that contemporaries found deeply unsettling. This was not the chaotic violence of opportunistic raiders. Sweyn moved through England with the precision of a man who had studied his target for years. Because he had. He sacked Norwich. He burned Thetford. He moved through the countryside with the patience of someone who was not in a hurry because he had already decided how this ended. English. Towns began paying him directly just to be left alone. The social fabric of the kingdom was unraveling. Ethelred's authority, never particularly solid, was becoming theoretical. And then, in the summer of 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard arrived in England, not to raid, but to conquer. This was different. Everyone who watched his fleet arrive understood that this was different. He landed in the north, at the Humber estuary, and the north of England surrendered to him almost immediately. The Danelaw, the regions of England, with the heaviest Danish settlement and Danish heritage, had no particular loyalty to Ethelred. They submitted to Sweyn with a speed that must have been humiliating for the English king to witness. Then, Oxford submitted. Then Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, the symbolic heart of English royal power. Then London. London held briefly, and held partly because Ethelred himself was there. But when it became clear that the rest of England had already accepted Sweyn as king, London's resistance became a formality. The city negotiated. The gates opened. Ethelred the Unready fled England. He crossed the Channel to Normandy, to the court of his brother-in-law, and sat in exile watching the kingdom he had ruled for 30 years be absorbed into the Danish empire of the man whose sister he had murdered. Sweyn Forkbeard was proclaimed King of England in the winter of 1013. Thus, entire kingdom, every corner of it, taken not in a single dramatic battle, but through more than a decade of relentless, methodical, patient work. Gunhilda had been dead for 11 years. Sweyn had not forgotten her for a single one of them. Here is where history adds one final detail that feels almost too precise to be real. Sweyn Forkbeard died on the 3rd of February, 1014. Just 5 weeks after being proclaimed King of England, he did not die in battle. He did not die at the hands of an enemy. He died by most accounts of illness, suddenly, unexpectedly, at what was probably the peak of his power. Ethelred returned to England. He reclaimed his throne. He died 2 years later, and the struggle for England continued through his son, Edmund, and eventually through Sweyn's own son, Knut, who would go on to rule England for nearly 20 years and become one of the most powerful kings in European history. But that is a different story. Sweyn's story ended in February, in winter, as king of everything he had set out to take. 5 weeks was not long, but he died as king. Ethelred died as a man who had fled his own kingdom and been let back in only because his enemy stopped breathing first. There is a difference in those two endings, a significant one. History is full of revenge stories, betrayals and battles and dynasties built on the graves of insults that someone refused to forget. But most of them are messy, incomplete, tangled up in politics and accident and the random cruelty of circumstance. Sweyn's story is different because of its shape. It has a shape. A wrong was committed. A man decided that wrong would not go unanswered. He spent 11 years building the answer, and then he delivered it completely, thoroughly, without leaving anything unfinished. He did not destroy Ethelred personally. He destroyed what Ethelred had: the kingdom, the authority, the legacy. He took the thing a king values more than his own life, the crown, and he held it. That is not just revenge, that is architecture. The coldest, most patient, most complete architecture of consequence that the early medieval world ever produced. There is something worth sitting with in this story, beyond the spectacle of it. Sweyn Forkbeard did not let grief make him reckless. He let it make him focused. Every decision for more than a decade pointed in the same direction. Every alliance, every campaign, every winter spent preparing rather than reacting, all of it oriented toward a single outcome. The outcome arrived, and the man who had ordered a massacre on a November morning in 1002, the man who had thought he could eliminate a threat by eliminating people, the man who had been poorly counseled his entire life and had earned his nickname honestly, he died in exile, while Sweyn died a king. Do you think Sweyn Forkbeard's revenge was justified?